Thank you guys so much for coming back. That's really thrilling because, as I say, this is a bit of a marathon. I just want to say a few very brief words to put this into context. When I was developing the screenplay for East is East over a 2.5-year period with the writer, he of course told me the entire story of his family's history. And it became very clear to me way back then, about 12 years ago now, that there was at least one other film to be made about the continuing journey of this family. I won't go into the detail of what that hook was that totally persuaded me, because I don't want to give any of the plot away. But in story terms, 5 years have passed, and only little Sajid is now left at home. In real time terms, 10 years passed between the making of East is East and the making of West is West. Generally speaking, sequels disappoint. Generally, people look at a sequel and say, oh, it was good, but it wasn't as good as the first one. This was not a sequel cynically made. It wasn't a sequel made because the first film had been so successful. It was a sequel which was conceived in my heart before the first one was even filmed. And so for me, it was always the holding up of the mirror and the other story that absolutely needed to be told to make a complete family of films. East is East and West is West, and never the twain shall meet, said Rudyard Kipling. I pray with all my heart that they do meet, and the writer and I have started talking about part 3 where they will meet. Please enjoy the second film. Thank you. You are amazing, you guys, for staying. Thank you, thank you. It's actually quite possible that you will be the only audiences in the United States to have seen this film. And I'm really sad to say this may be the case well beyond today, because this film has not found distribution in America. And it hasn't found distribution for the most shocking of reasons, certainly very shocking to me. And it was very explicitly expressed by a company that, a distributor that normally does distribute independent films, Sony Classics. And this is exactly what the head of acquisitions of Sony Classics said about the film. Having seen it premiere at Toronto last September, on a gala premiere to 1,800 people in the audience who gave it a 5-minute standing ovation, so we couldn't have hoped for a better response. And he had professed to like the film very much indeed and was seriously considering acquiring it. And then after internal discussion, this is exactly what he said. The world is a very different place now to what it was when East is East came out. Pakistan is now the #1 enemy, and the people of America will not embrace a film that is set in Pakistan. Now, I mean, to me, I can't tell you what that does to me. I can't tell you how those words sear my heart, because it's this very kind of film that makes a plea for tolerance and for understanding. That scene between the two women where they don't have one word of each other's language, but they communicate on a very deep and fundamental level. And if we can't do that in this world, there is no hope for us whatsoever. And so the very film that should be seen in this country is not going to be seen. It breaks my heart. But there it is. That's life. Please ask questions. At the back first.
Are you going to have CDs?
Well, I've actually just spent a couple of days in LA talking to a DVD distribution company, and if the distributors are not going to take it for the theatres, we will, of course, try and distribute it on DVD. And so at some point in the next few months, it will be released on DVD, I hope, in the States. It has been released in the UK, where it had the most thrilling of releases, 16 weeks, $4.5 million at the UK box office. Day one of DVD sales, 31,000 DVDs sold. By now, 150-something thousand. That's Region 2 PAL DVDs. By the way, can I just finish off the story of the, Pakistan is the #1 enemy. When I heard this, I was so shocked, I was so upset, that I persuaded my financiers to put another £12,000, $18,000, into having a test screening of the film done by a very prominent test screening company called First Movies. And the reason it's so expensive for one night's test screening, $18,000, is because you end up with a 38-page report that tells you everything about that they choose the audience according to the demographic of the country's audience, the profile of, so many Latinos, so many, in a very cynical way. But the reason it's so expensive is because it is always highly predictive. And studios always, when they put out their films, do a test screening first. The test screening in the States scored higher than the test screening in the UK. 90% of the test screening audiences said they would recommend this film to be seen on the big screen to their friends. And 78% of the test screening audience ticked either excellent or very good. No one ticked poor, no one ticked fair, and the rest, the 22% that didn't tick excellent or very good, ticked good, but that doesn't count. It's only very good and excellent that count for the two top box scores. And when asked in this questionnaire, why did you like the film? If you liked it, what did you most like about it? The most ticked, referred to response was, it was set in Pakistan, we found this fascinating, this was a culture and a place we knew nothing about, this film taught us that people are people everywhere, we all have the same stories, it gave me insights, it moved me, it surprised me, I learned something I didn't know. The precise reason the gatekeeper had given for not letting this film through to distribution in this country was what they got from it, it would appear, from that test screening. So, yes.
Leslie, can you tell us a little bit about the journey from the first film to the second film? It's about a 10-year gap, I guess, between films. Were they originally planned as a two-part, were you planning two films originally? Can you just tell us a little bit about how we get from
Absolutely.
A to B?
When I was preparing East is East with the writer, East is East was my very first feature film. I had produced two films for television at that point, but never, feature film is quite a different ballgame and incredibly challenging. So I had my work cut out just focusing on that one film. But during the development of the screenplay with Ayub, he of course told me that as a 14-year-old boy, his father took him to Pakistan. And the minute I heard that, I knew there was another film. Whereas the first one is set in the UK, I knew there had to be another one set in Pakistan. But we couldn't incorporate that in the journey of the first film because, the focus of the film has to be incredibly tight. And so I just kind of parked that in my heart and decided that, one day we'll make number two. And I was utterly convinced that the first film would be a great hit. I was literally, I think, the only one to believe that. None of the film companies in the UK would fund that film, or indeed in Europe. I mean, I knocked on every door going, and everyone turned it down for very spurious reasons. Back then, 10 years ago, there had never been a mainstream film that had, to put it bluntly, that had brown faces in it. You know, and it was simply thought that this would be some art house ghetto film that would only be seen in, you know, some... But I knew that it has the spirit of, you know, we're all human beings. I mean, to me that was such a prejudiced and bigoted view, and I knew it would be mainstream, so I always knew we'd be making the second. But East is East was so successful that it inhibited the writer. And he thought, I'm not going to write another one. Why spoil a good thing? You know, why rock the boat? And it took me literally 5 years to persuade him to actually embrace the notion of writing a sequel. And I said, you know, what's the worst that can happen? I'll pay you a big bunch of money to write it. And if it's not good enough to be a standalone film, if you're not proud of it, if I'm not proud of it, we won't do it. We'll only do it if it stands on its own rights for people who have never seen part one. And so he said okay, he'd give it a go, and we worked for another 2 years, and we both, I mean, just, you know, fell in love with it. I think what's really remarkable about that 10-year gap, the gift of that 10-year gap, is that Ayub, by this point, had grown, had matured, had become a father himself. And whereas he was just a very angry young man when he wrote the first film, and trying to exorcise his extremely negative feelings about his father, who he felt completely and utterly oppressed him and crushed him, by part two, I think he really understood his father and where he was coming from, and that, you know, there were glimmers of that in East is East when the father said, I'm only trying to do the best for you, I'm doing what is right for you. But in the second film, I think, you know, we really have him atone and realize, come face to face with his sins and his transgressions, you know, and he comes there thinking he knows the place. So I'm very glad of the 10-year gap in retrospect. There was a question here, yes?
I agree with you. It's a great film, and I'd love other people in our country to see it. Is there no other way? I mean, I think about technology and social media and the fact that you can have a grassroots type of movement that might generate some interest that'll maybe pique the interest of some of those film executives and be willing to give it another go.
Yeah, I think, you know, the problem is that once it is out on DVD, those distributors won't want to touch it because, you know, theatrical releases are very often the loss leader for them. They are so expensive now. Advertising is just so ludicrously expensive that they very often have to spend the whole budget of the film all over again just in prints and advertising. Now in this case, I actually have 200 prints already made from the UK release because that was a very wide one. So the prints wouldn't cost, but the advertising would. And for them to put out, you know, a lot of money to advertise the film theatrically, they would have to rely on the DVD sales to recoup that, and the TV and satellite and cable. So it's a kind of, you know, in pragmatic terms, it's a vicious circle. Because if I go off now and try and disseminate it, I'll stop any chance of it being theatrically distributed. On the other hand, there is nobody who is prepared to theatrically distribute it. I mean, what I really would like to do, but it takes a lot of time, and you see, I'm a producer, I'm not a distributor. I've already been with this film for 1 year longer, and for no money at all. I've been travelling with this film since last July, just because I'm so impassioned by it and I believe in it so much. and also because I had individual financiers in this film for the first time in my life, and I take that very seriously. I literally will not sleep at night until they are paid back. So, you know, ideally what I should do is go to small individual chains, the Vickers Theatre, apparently, you know, locally, the Landmark chain, just, you know, small chains, and try and persuade them to have it on for a couple of weeks even, because I know word of mouth would spread, you know. You don't get a test screening result like that with 90% of them saying they would recommend it without that actually happening. But it's going to take, you know, a big effort, and it's not my field. But I will now start looking into that, because I'm pretty convinced now that none of the distributors are going to come good on this. Yeah.
So the justification that they gave you, it brings to mind the Kite Runner. Afghanistan was our #1 enemy when that came out.
Then.
So what was...
Where did you see the Kite Runner? And what was the release of the Kite Runner in this country? Does anyone here know? Was it a very small art house release? Was it?
No. I feel like everyone saw it at some point. I felt like it got...
Really? It was a wide release. Did it win a Best Foreign Film Oscar, by any chance?
I don't think so.
It didn't? Well, I'll look into that and I'll see who distributed that.
Find out what path they took, because they were definitely at the top.
Well, it was a New York
of the
Times bestseller, though.
Right, it was
before.
New York Times bestseller for the book.
Yeah,
Which may have influenced. You see, I don't know. It's very, very often the case that for a film, a British independent film, to actually get seen here and break through, it has to have had some kind of Oscar nomination, or have won Cannes, or, you know, have been a New York bestseller, or it's just something needs to...
That was it. The book was a bestseller.
The book was a bestseller. Yeah, that doesn't surprise me. Because they won't take risks, you know, and distributors are fundamentally lazy. They don't like working for a living. They like to have a name to put on a poster that'll do all the work, you know, Meryl Streep in, or whatever, and then they sit back and don't have to nurture the film or work for it. I can't choose. Anthony, choose. I want you all to ask.
How many film festivals have you been putting it in?
Quite a lot. We premiered at Toronto. We did Abu Dhabi. I must tell you something about Abu Dhabi. Are you in the mood to hear another little story? Sure. Okay, so having heard what I heard from the US, and by the way, Miramax Fox Searchlight said difficult film for America. They meant the same thing, of course, but, you know, difficult film for America, okay. In Abu Dhabi, I went, we opened the festival. We had one screening of the film, and I went with Puri, who plays the father, and Ilarun, who plays the first wife. And we're doing a Q&A after the film, and one audience member asks me, how come I'm so passionate about this film? I'm not a Pakistani, clearly, so why am I so passionate? And I look out, and I'm looking at what I can only describe as a sea of the Arab world, okay? Because all the men are in their long white gowns with their long white, you know, veils and the black keffiyeh, I think it's called. And what women there are, they're not that many, are in black robes with just their eyes showing or just their faces showing. And I'm compelled to say, it just pops out of me, and I say, well, I think it may be to do with the fact, and I'll tell you something now that will surprise you, I hope won't shock you, and I certainly hope won't displease you. I'm an Israeli. I'm born in Israel. And there was this complete shocking silence, shocking, of like 20 seconds that felt incredibly dangerous and felt like you could cut it with a knife. And I immediately regretted, because I'm very impulsive, I'm very truthful, I like telling things as I feel them. And I was moved to say that then, because it seemed to me very pertinent and very relevant. And I immediately regretted the possibility of having embarrassed my two stars who flanked me. But I kind of brought the conversation back and said, you know, this is why I hate stereotypes and I hate borders. And I believe that we are all citizens of the world, we are all the same people, we all have the same stories, and we have to listen to each other and understand each other. So it all came back onto an even keel, and I had a very moving exchange with one of the gentlemen in the audience afterwards in the foyer. He embraced me. He said he thought I was very brave to tell the audience I was Israeli. And he and I actually both shed tears and, you know, just spoke about how similar we were. And I said, just look at your face and look at my face and you look like my brother. You know, this is just, it's insane. We are cousins. We are the same family, you know. And then 2 weeks later, I start getting approaches on Facebook from Mustafa in Egypt, a journalist, and Abdul from Egypt, and about 8 or 9 people from Egypt, a few of them who were journalists, saying, we have heard that you have told the Abu Dhabi Festival that you are an Israelian, rather sweetly written A-L-I-E-N. And then one of them said, there is a rumor that you have said you are an Israelian and proud to be an Israelian. And I wrote back to every one of these 8, 9, I can't quite remember how many, but I wrote back long and honest letters and explained the context in which I had, you know, made the remark and why I thought it was relevant. And also pointed out that no, it was not true. I had not said I was proud of being an Israeli, because how can you be proud of something you haven't actually achieved? But then I get sent an article. The head of the union of all artists, writers, musicians, actors in Egypt has called a boycott on the Abu Dhabi Film Festival and has demanded that they withdraw the prize from me, that they apologize for having given it to an Israeli, and vow never to give it to an Israeli again. Because in giving it to me, they were normalizing the brutality of Israel against Palestine. So, you know, you've seen the film. It's an innocent film, for heaven's sake. It's talking about fathers and children and identity and coming of age and, you know, the sins we all commit and regret and emotional abandonment and having gone wrong and made mistakes, the most human of the... There's no religion in this, there's no politics in this film. So this innocent film becomes this political football between East and West and, you know, every fanatic going. It's just heartbreaking, it's heartbreaking. Yeah.
So I am from Pakistan. I am a student here at Notre Dame doing my PhD. I want to sincerely thank you for painting Pakistan in good light and breaking some stereotypes. Also want to thank the Devortolo Performing Arts Center because they are, you know, their commitment to diversity, their commitment to endurance and tolerance. I really appreciate your good work.
That's so wonderful to hear. And you know, I mean, I'm sure that there'll be people here whose classrooms I've been in or who will have heard me say that there is not yet one screening I've been at around the world where I haven't had at least one Pakistani audience member say exactly what you've just said. And more often than not, it's Pakistani families coming up to me with tears streaming down their faces, holding my hand and saying passionately what you've just said, which is, you've allowed me to hold my head up high again. Now, what are we talking about here? Just by saying that you're human beings? It's as simple as that. It's a humanizing film, that's all it is. It's not that, you know, Pakistanis are painted as, you know, saints who don't make mistakes, who are... The film is full of flawed people. We all make mistakes. But all the film does is humanize a nation that is currently demonized. And that cannot be right. It cannot be right, you know, that when millions of people, how many people died in the floods in Pakistan? And there wasn't real help. You know, the nations of the world did not really give the money because the entire population of ordinary people like Bashir Khan, you know, who were made homeless and washed out in these floods, was demonized. These were demons. They were two-headed monsters. Why help them? Why give them money? I mean, the world is so troubled. What are we going to do? What are we going to do, you know, for our children?
I just also have a suggestion for you.
Yeah.
If you cannot get DVD distributors, and that I hope you do, but if you don't, then you may consider releasing it on file sharing.
On the internet?
Yeah, on the internet, legally, because, you know, it will anyway be available illegally. So you can consider...
I know that. I mean, obviously, you know, my prime responsibility is to my financiers, who were brave and courageous and at a time of economic crisis in England, actually, you know, put out money. One person put £1 million into this film, and I will not sleep until he has his money back. It's quite simple, you know, and there's no reason why he shouldn't get it back. It's just going to take longer. But there was another question.
Hi. Since I'm Israeli, I have like a million questions to ask.
Shalom, Motek.
Shalom. Shalom bracha. מה שלומך? הכל טוב. I don't know. There's just so many things I would like to ask, but I guess putting the politics aside for a moment, this is a film also about immigrant identity, and so on. So when you take, I gather from your accent, you probably have not lived in Israel for quite a while now.
Not for a very long time. I left there when I was 9 years old.
And you've spent your life, if I may ask, in Britain?
Most of my life, but I spent my formative years in South Africa during the dark old days of apartheid. My father was a South African and he took the whole family out to South Africa when I was 9 years old.
So, if I may ask, can you say something about how do you feel in the sense of immigrant identity and sort of having these multiple sources of identity, clashes, conflicts, and so on? I can only assume there was some sort of a personal motivation from you for that then as well.
Totally. You know, when I said that the reason I fell in love with East is East as a piece of work was because I felt it was my story. I had absolutely the same relationship with my father, who was trying very hard for all the best reasons to ensure that I lived an observant life, eating kosher food and not riding on a Saturday, and he was a religious Jew. And it mattered to him, and he tried to impose those values on me. And when it came to, I had a son first, and I refused to circumcise that son. I couldn't and wouldn't do it. And to Jews, that is absolute taboo. I mean, I was an outcast immediately. My father disowned me for 6 months. He wouldn't talk to me. So I completely identified with this story, you know. Yes?
I just have a sensitive question, but since we're in an atmosphere of open-mindedness and tolerance, would you consider take your courage, because you're very courageous and I admire you for that, would you take a step forward and consider humanizing Palestinians, for example?
Absolutely. I mean, there are no bars for me whatsoever as far as we are all human beings. And no question, you know, if there's a story, basically I can only operate from the heart and do one film at a time. I spend 4 years of my life on each film I make because I produce alone and I don't compromise, and I only do films I really love and really have complete faith in. And yes, I mean, I would go out of my way to read anything that anyone suggested, and yeah, I would love to do that. If you know of a story that you think, you know, would appeal. I also think it's quite important to have humour in them. You know, particularly when you have something significant and resonant to say, you don't want to say it with too heavy a hand, I think. It's hard enough, even when there's humour involved, to get it released. Yes.
I just feel in that regard that both of these films have so much the same character of Preston Sturges in the late 30s. And a film like Sullivan's Travels in particular, where he makes the point that we've got to have humor, but there's a depth to it and tragedy to it, as well as this delightful story. And I feel very much you've captured those qualities in both of these films.
Wonderful. I'm thrilled. That's music to my ears, as your laugh was during the screening, particularly yours, Mr. Smith. Any other? Please feel free to go. It's late, but I mean, I'll stay here until the last question is asked. So please feel free to carry on asking or to leave. No pressure to stay, but I'm more than happy to carry on.